You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 59. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. This episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by the resources of Transforming Mission. You can find the resources and downloads for this episode at transformingmission.org/059. On today's episode, we're going to walk through and build upon the previous 4 episodes around rumbling with vulnerability. In episode 59, we're going to specifically talk about how to rumble with vulnerability. So, Tim, you want to remind us what rumbling with vulnerability is all about?
A rumble with vulnerability is a discussion or a conversation or a meeting that's defined by the following: a commitment to do the following. We're going to lean into vulnerability. We're going to be vulnerable in our conversation. We're going to stay curious and generous. We're going to stick with the messy middle. We're going to be fearless in owning our own parts of our thoughts and feelings. And we'll listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard. In other words, we're going to be Christian. We're going to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us. Really, the heart of the rumble is, let's listen how we want people to listen to us. Let's speak to one another as we would like to have people speak to us.
I might say it with one short phrase. Saying to someone, let's rumble, is not a fight. It's about having a real conversation, even when it's tough. Building on that, in terms of how to rumble with vulnerability and have those tough conversations, in the last episode, we talked about, are you ready to rumble? So you can listen to that episode at transformingmission.org/058. That would be the first thing that you'd want to do before you ever enter into a rumble, is to first walk through the checklist, everyone involved, to make sure that you're ready to step into the conversation. The next step would be what is called container building. And this is really building the space, the environment, creating the context for the conversation so that people can name what is needed and what's going to get in the way of having those conversations. So we want to walk through 3 questions that you can ask to really set the tone or build the container for the conversation, and then we'll move on from there. So, Tim, what's the first question?
What do you need to show up and have the conversation?
So, when you answer this question, think about the things that will help you feel like you can say what is on your heart, in your mind, again, in a Christian way. So this isn't bleeding all over one another. This isn't being a jerk to people just because you've now said that you're going to rumble. This is about creating space and the context for this conversation. So you might say you need. Yeah, sure. What might you say?
Well, I'd like to have a sense of trust in the conversation, where I know that where we're talking to one another, that it's that I'm, again, it's going to be held with some kind of care, and it's not going to be used against me.
And I think the thing that I would add to that is that what I would need is to know that you're going to listen to me. That even if I ramble trying to get to my point and figure out what I'm trying to say, you're going to listen and ask the questions so that we can get to that place together. Because if you're simply checking a box or sitting back with your arms crossed and don't appear as though you are listening, it's going to be hard for me to show up and have the conversation.
I like that.
So what's number 2?
What will get in the way of showing up and having the conversation?
So I might have just identified one of those.
I think one of them that might get in my way is that if I have any suspicion that what we're going to talk about's already been decided, and you're trying to manipulate me to go a different direction. In other words, if you're not going to take me seriously, or we're not going to be able to have a real conversation, would get in the way for me.
So the third question is, what does support look like, and who does that support come from? So in a supervisory setting, this might be, what do you need from your supervisor to support you in whatever decisions are made or are not made during this rumble? It may be, if you're rumbling with your spouse or your family, it might be that support's going to look like giving one another a hug after the rumble's over. It might be going out for ice cream afterwards and doing something totally different, going for a bike ride. What does support look like? Thoughts from you on that one, Tim?
Sure. If I can go back to something that we talked about a couple of episodes ago, you and I were going to lead a rumble with some of the pastors in the district. Mm-hmm. And when we asked the question, what does support look like? Really, it was the assurance that what we talked about wasn't going to go any farther than that room. It wasn't going to be something that was going to be used against us, that this was really a safe place to have the conversation.
So that's the second part of how to rumble with vulnerability. Make sure that you build the container for having the conversation. And what I often say to folks on that one, in answering those 3 questions, is those are questions that we look at and we kind of roll our eyes sometimes and say, well, why do we need to answer those? Can't we just get to the conversation? But without answering those 3 questions, you are making assumptions about the people that you are rumbling with, that they're all in the same place and have the same needs as you have. And so you're going to run into trouble. You're going to take longer to have the conversation because you might not have the same expectations of what is happening, and you haven't taken the time to build the container. So it might take you 15 minutes to be able to do this with a group of people, but it is probably the most important part of being able to rumble, is to set the context for the conversation and have everybody name what they need, what's going to get in the way, and what support looks like.
Sara, I like this particularly because it takes us into a place, I think, where a positive conversation can be had. Throughout my years of ministry, it might have been sometimes the ground rules for a conversation, or what are the parameters of a conversation. And that was really more of a technical kind of setup, and I find this more of an adaptive setup. What I find this to do is it actually allows us to begin to have conversation before we really have conversation.
Right. And so the point here would be, if this is a group or a team that you're working with on an ongoing basis, you don't just want to have the conversation or go around the table and have everyone answer each one of these 3 questions. You want to come to a common understanding of what this conversation is going to be about, and well, not what the conversation is going to be about, but how you're going to live together, so that everyone can say, yes, I can offer you what you need in this conversation, and I know that I'm going to get what I need in this conversation, as well as here's what's going to get in the way. So you work together to come to a place where you say, okay, this is what we all need, and this is what is going to get in the way, so that everybody takes responsibility for it. It's not one person saying, here's what I need, and this is what we're going to operate from. That's my memory of those conversations, is somebody writes the ground rules up on the up on the board and says, does everybody agree to these? And then everybody kind of looks at one another like, well, who are we to disagree? And then they never get paid. Nobody pays attention to them for the rest of the conversation.
So just as we've both have said, I'll say it again, gives us an opportunity to have interaction, build relationship before we ever enter into the conversation.
The next step is defining the challenge or problem that you're going to have a conversation about. So what is the topic of your rumble? Often, this is the place where it really comes to light that, oh, we've been having a conversation, and part of why we've been having trouble is because we're talking about and working on different things. So, as an example of that, we hosted a rumble with our pastors and asked them to answer that question around what the results were from General Conference and everything happening around both the legislation that was passed, the things that are going to Judicial Council, and the overall tone and tenor of what is happening in their local churches. And I think we had over 15 different challenges that between two groups were identified, all around the same topic, but nobody defined the problem, the challenge, in the same way.
You're right.
I don't need to be right.
Okay, you're correct.
I don't need to be correct.
I think some of the things that were identified as challenges or problems, I think were just articulated in different ways. Some of them could have been combined to say, these are the same. But
in your mind, but in their mind, it wasn't.
You're right. That's the reason we had that conversation and probably needed to spend more time in defining what the challenge really is.
Yeah. And so this step is necessary if you're going to actually have a rumble. Now, if it is crystal clear to everyone and you come and say, look, we're going to have a conversation around setting the budget for 2019, 2020, and that is clear to everyone, then there's not much of a conversation there. But if it is around a topic that has brought about conflict or stress or anxiety, if it's something that is really an adaptive issue, not a tactical or technical issue, you're going to need to have some conversation and really identify what's the challenge before us and what are we going to be having a conversation about. Back to our conversation last week, we couldn't have a conversation about resolving anything because the group of people that we were meeting with were not delegates to General Conference, and we were not General Conference. And General Conference is the only body in our denomination that can speak on behalf of the church. So that was not the conversation that we were having. We were having conversation to build trust, to seek understanding, to get to a place that we might continue to grow in our relationships with one another and continue to be leaders in the area of Central Ohio that we are a part of. And we know that we have pastors in a variety of places and churches in a variety of places. And so we wanted to come together both to support individuals, but also to create a place that we could seek some understanding and learn from one another in the midst of that. So, are you ready to have the actual rumble? And are you ready to rumble with vulnerability? What we want to do for the rest of this episode is talk about some rumble starters. And what rumble starters are their short sentence stems that help you to actively listen to one another and engage in the conversation so that you are not jumping to conclusions or making a decision before a decision is actually made, but you're staying engaged and staying focused on that container that you've built and on the topic, the challenge that you have identified as a group.
So, Sara, one of the things that you've said about rumble starters, maybe we can ask folks who are listening to think of a hard conversation that, well, just do it this way. Think of a conversation that you've had or that you're planning to have, and think of these rumble starters. Which of these feel more natural for you that might help you lead into a hard conversation? You can keep that in mind as we go through these.
Yeah, I describe these as clothes. Some of them are going to feel better when you put them on, and some of them you're going to go, ooh, I don't like the way this feels, and you're going to take it off immediately. So we're going to walk through just a few of them, and there will be a download available for you at transformingmission.org/059 that will give you 11 rumble starters and also remind you of what does it mean to rumble with vulnerability, and include the outline of how to rumble with vulnerability. So, Tim, what is our first rumble starter?
The story I make up is. What's the story you make up, Sara?
Oh, I'm gonna go with one because it just happened. So we were recording a couple of episodes of LeaderCast, and we got to the end of one, and Tim said, my phone is blowing up with text messages and phone calls. I don't know what is going on. And immediately, the story I made up was, oh no, something tragic has happened with one of our churches, with one of our pastors. That immediately where my mind went. I was totally making that up. I had no idea who the messages were even from. Another one might be the story that I make up. You see someone leave from the sanctuary, and people are going, oh, they're mad. That's the story that they make up, when the reality is they brought their young grandchildren with them to worship, and their pager, their buzzer, their phone, however they were communicating with the grandparent, went off, and they needed to go tend to their grandchild in the nursery. So we're really creative people. We think that we're not, but we fill in the blanks with things that we have no idea of what is going on all of the time.
Yeah, the basic way I say it is we make up what we don't know.
Yes.
And to have a true rumble with vulnerability, we must understand when we're beginning to make up the story.
And so in a rumble, when that can happen is you hear someone around the table, and I'm situating this in a group conversation. So you hear someone in the conversation talk about something that you think is really them talking about you, but they're not speaking to you. It feels like they're talking about you. And so you make that leap, and that would be a place in the rumble that you could say, can I just offer you something here? The story I'm making up is the illustration that you just offered was directed at me. And it's likely that that person's going to say, that had absolutely nothing to do with you. Or they might say, well, I wasn't directing it at you. Can you tell me more of why you thought that it was? Now you're starting to rumble, and you're starting to rumble with vulnerability.
So you ready for another one?
Sure.
Well, let me preface this one by saying that one of the things that I say a lot when I'm in conversation is say, I'm going to ask some questions for clarity. So it may be, help me understand what you're saying or what you mean by that. Another way that I use that one is, let me say back to you what I think I just heard you say. Mm-hmm. And I'm repeating back in a way in which I may be articulating a little differently, but it's so that everyone understands that I understand, or I'm saying it so I do understand, and they can say, that's that is what we said, or that's not what we said. And then I can say, well, help me understand.
So one of the places, and you do this all of the time in terms of help me understand, but one of the places that I remember you doing that with me was in a conversation that we had around the differences in the way that my experience in ministry has been and your experience in ministry has been, both from a generational perspective and from the perspective of me being a woman in ministry and you being a man in ministry. And I remember you saying to me over and over again, help me understand. And really? that has been your experience? Expand on that. Help me to understand what that experience has been like. And then I think you said something silly like, because I'm not a woman. The obvious statement of the whole conversation.
Sara, you've been very patient with me, because I think there were times, now I'm projecting, but I think there were times that you thought, how in the world could you miss that?
There have only been a couple of instances that I thought that. But I think the conversation that I'm remembering most recently, I realized, and this was why we had the conversation to begin with, because I realized that you didn't see what was happening. And if I didn't take the initiative to name it for you, I was going to continue to be frustrated by what was happening. And you wouldn't have the opportunity to say, really? That happened? And I didn't see it happening. And so we both learned from that. In the moment that this particular conversation that we had, I think 2 or 3 days after the incident happened, I should have spoken up in that moment. I didn't, because I was too frustrated. But when we did have the conversation, what I remember is I remembered learning in that moment of, you know what, Sara, just speak up in that moment that it's happening. Speak up in the moment that you feel like you're being pushed aside. That was the nature of it. I felt like I was being pushed aside because I was female and wasn't allowed to step into a place of leadership that I had. This is going to sound arrogant, so please forgive me. I don't mean it to be. I had every right to be in leadership, and I had earned the right to be in leadership.
And if I remember that conversation, there was another piece of that conversation that, out of a presentation that I had made, you helped me understand that even the images I was using were more male-dominated than female-dominated. In fact, everything I used was very much male-centered. And so out of that conversation, number one, you found a way in which that you needed to speak sooner. But because of that conversation, now I think the speaking up piece wasn't necessarily because I had put you aside or dismissed you.
Please.
It was somebody else. That I didn't, and I did feel, and so what I've learned out of that as well is that if you don't speak up, I need to. That was part of our conversation. Right. But the other part of that conversation was that when you helped me see images that I was using to communicate even the good news, and I was limited in what I was saying, I made some adjustments at that point, and I think made the presentation even better. That's my biased opinion, of course.
Of course it was your biased opinion. So just from that story and that illustration, and please hear me loud and clear, me not feeling like I could be in a place of leadership, Tim was in no way, shape, or form responsible for that. It was not his doing at all. So please don't hear me saying that. The conversation between Tim and I afterwards, as I think back on it, was a wonderful example of both of us rumbling with vulnerability, because the conversation started in one place and led to a totally different place. And both of us walked away, I think, well, I'll speak for myself, and you just named it in terms of your own experience. I walked away thinking differently about the whole situation. And I can just imagine if we had not had that conversation, what could begin to snowball or fester, whatever word you want to use, into something that is ugly and unintended, simply because someone in the life of the church pushed me aside, and simply because after that happened, what I hear in a message that you're delivering is a whole bunch of male-centered images and illustrations, and I'm going, what the heck is going on?
So that's a place where true vulnerability brought us to a place of trust. And out of that trust allows us to be even more vulnerable.
Correct. You want to do one more?
Sure. Let's try this one. In conversations that you have with people, sometimes they use different terms for things. And we immediately have some idea or an assumption about the terms that are being used. And let's try this, since this is where we are right now in the United Methodist Church. Terms like progressive or evangelical, or terms like Wesleyan or Orthodox. Immediately, sometimes when we hear those terms, we immediately jump to a place and automatically we label people. And labeling people, we stereotype them. Mm-hmm. We already put some people inside and other people outside based upon our agreement with our assumption. So really, the rumble starter is when you hear that, when I hear that word or those words, this is my assumption. What do you mean by them? So that we begin to have a conversation about some common ground around even the terms that we use. So that's part of rumbling with vulnerability.
Another way that I might say what you just illustrated, Tim, is if you ever find yourself censoring the words that you're saying because you think that someone is going to hear that word in a different way, you've got a great rumble starter to use. I'm working from this assumption. How about you? Or you're using hot button words, and so you take the initiative to name that and say it. I'm going to use some words, and I'm going to tell you the assumptions that I make when I use those words, and then I want to hear what you think when you hear those words, so that it becomes a conversation and not telling someone the way that they should think about something. So as we've done with the previous 4 episodes, we have another tool available for you that is in the form of Rumble Starters, and you can find that at transformingmission.org/059. So once again, you can download Rumble Starters, another resource for leaders brought to you by Transforming Mission to help you deepen your relationships with Christ, the congregation, and your community, all so you can lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.